So let's get started. So it's so nice to see people here in person and online. I think that's our appreciation of the access we get remotely and our ability to see people is maybe one of the silver linings of this whole Corona period. We're working on getting the best of both worlds. So thank you for joining us online. Thank you for coming out in person. My name is Leon Shoham. I'm the director of the Interagency Task Force on Israeli-Arab Issues. We're so fortunate and happy to be partnering with the New Israel Fund to host a discussion with directors of Sikkuy Aufoq, a shared organization advancing equality and partnership between Jewish and Arab citizens of Israel. We have with us Ofer Dagan, Amjad, Shbita, the co-directors, and Marsha Shamo, the director of strategy and partnerships. Before we dive in, I want to ask the from the New Israel Fund to say a few words to help frame the discussion.
Thank you so much. And it's nice to see everybody. As I'm sitting here, I am realizing that this is the first one of these that I've done in 2.5 years after being somebody who was doing them like almost every day. So I'm disoriented, but very happy to see people in person from Israel and on Zoom. It's also a great honor and pleasure to serve on the executive committee of the task force as the NIF representative and to really continue to deepen the partnership and explore the overlaps in our work. And Sikkuy Aufoq is about the best possible overlap that I could think of as really primary experts in the whole field of shared society for so many years and advocates across issues that affect Arab and Jewish citizens of the state. The two pieces that I wanted to share just by way of opening and situating the words that we're going to hear from the perspective of the ecosystem of work that we support on the ground in shared society are really two things. One, as many of you know, NIF and Shatil have been promoting shared society for many years. In recent years, we've been talking about the real need to deepen and promote Arab-Jewish partnership across all levels of society, from the government to the grassroots, from the schools to the hospitals to the streets. And I think we've turned to Sikkuy as an all-encompassing advocacy shop that really does reach Arab-Jewish partnership on all of these levels. And particularly for this conversation, I think it's important to understand the intersections between what we think of as like narrative and identity driven work and then economic and social gaps, closing economic and social gaps, and the ways in which those things work together and sometimes don't work together and need some push. So I think we're going to be talking about that more today. And the other thing, just in terms of ecosystem, is that in recent years, we've seen more activity happening at the actual grassroots and movement building level, whether it's online with organizations like Zazim, Community Action, or whether it's in the streets with organizations like Omdim B'Yachad, Standing Together, who are very much about mobilization in key moments. When I've talked to the leaders of those newer organizations about the ecosystem, they say things like, well, Sikkuy are kind of like the parents, like we wouldn't have any of this work to mobilize around if they hadn't been there doing this long-term advocacy step by step over these decades. And I think the younger mobilization organizations are strengthened so much by this long legacy of work and the continued expertise that you're bringing into the field. So with that, I'm turning it back over to you, Liron, to start the conversation. I'm so happy to see you. Welcome to New York. Welcome to the task force, to the New Israel Fund, and welcome to all of you.
Thank you, Libby. That was really, really excellent context. And I want to bring us a little bit. I mean, if you've been following headlines about Israel even a little in recent months, you know that it has been a fraught time in Jewish-Arab relations, especially. There's been tensions in Jerusalem over during the confluence of Ramadan and Passover. There's been a really unfortunate wave of terror attacks and government instability, all adding to a sense of uncertainty and fear that there will be not just further instability and tensions, but a replay of the violent events of last May. And as Libby said, Sikkuy has been working in the long haul for many, many years through many ups and downs, but it is really in this context that you're working to promote economic equality, especially in government policy, and advancing a broader recognition of the identity and culture of Arab citizens of Israel as part of a shared and inclusive society. So I want to ask you both about doing this kind of work at such heightened moments of inflection. But first, can we just start by learning a little bit about each of you? Tell us about yourself, who you are, and how did you come to this work? We'll start with you, Ofer.
Sure. So first of all, hello everyone, and thank you for coming today. For us as well, it's the first time doing this kind of talk in about 2.5 years, like in person and also in Zoom, but very exciting to be here. So a little bit about myself. I live in Beersheba. I grew up in Vadim, so most of my life I've been in the Negev in Israel. For the past decade, I think I've been active in various organizations promoting equality and society between Arabs and Jews in Israel. Initially, more focused on the Negev issues, unrecognized villages, etc. But in the past 6 years, I work in Sikkuy Aufoq in different positions, but in the past 2.5 years as co-executive director together with my friend and colleague Amjad. So this is in short about me.
Thank you, and hello everyone. I'm Amjad. I'm from Tiratown, the center of Israel. I began my career as a journalist and as a political advisor of Knesset Ofer. And I'm in Sikkuy for 12 years in different positions. But in the last 3 years, I am the co-director of Sikkuy with Ofer.
I want to start with the issues in the headlines in Jewish-Arab relations to set the context for diving into your work. So can we start with the fact that in recent months, there was an unfortunate wave of terror attacks, including 2 that were perpetrated by Arab citizens, and that these put the whole country on edge and really affect relations between Jewish and Arab citizens. What was the response? What can you tell us was the response within Arab society to these issues, and what has been some of the effect of Jewish-Arab relations?
I think if we are talking about the events of the last month, the situation in Israel stay the same as the events in May 2021. It's very sensitive, and in any moment it can be a big explosion, unfortunately. But in the last month, it was a very dangerous thing that happened. That was terrorist attack on citizens by ISIS activists, terrorists. And it was in the Negev. And in the Arab side, there was a very strong front against this attack. So because of this attack and because of the
Sorry, I'm just bringing the microphone. We're still learning how all of that works.
Sure.
Well,
and because of the very strong desire of the Arab society to stop this wave, this very dangerous wave of attacks. I think that the leadership, and we saw that in the last month, all of the leadership of the Arab society in the Negev and at the national level were commended this attack, and I think that it stopped the clashes with other elements from the side of the police and the government.
Yeah, I think complementary side of it was we saw also in Jerusalem. Yeah, like what that
Looks like it's on now.
the directional. There we go. There we go. And so right extremist movements they try to change the status quo in the Temple Mount, Al-Aqsa, and this was similar to what we saw last my event, but I think one big difference was the way the police and the security forces treated the situation, very volatile situation in Jerusalem, and we saw, I think, a much more responsible approach from the Ministry of Interior Security in Israel, led by the minister and by the CEO of the executive director of the ministry, which I think impacted a lot the potential volatility of the situation and helped to reduce the harm potential in those events. But still very worried, still afraid. When things began to happen, we were afraid that we were going to vision another round of what we saw last night. It's still danger, but
So this is a really big statement. I'm gonna, first of all, for those of you who may not be aware, during Ramadan, and this year it happened on Passover as well, there's hundreds of thousands of Muslims that go to pray at Al-Aqsa at the same time as Jewish worshippers going to Temple Mount over Passover. And Al-Aqsa is not only a religious site for all of the Arab Muslim world, for Arab society in Israel, it's also a national symbol, an expression of the connection of Arab citizens to the greater Palestinian community. It's the one place where control over this site is enshrined in law. It is for the Muslim community. And so police activity, Israel's security activity on Al-Aqsa Mosque often taps into national sentiments. It's very, very volatile, and it often happens when there's large crowd. Now, historically, I'm doing a tiny bit of lecture, I'll stop it. Historically, policing there's a big challenge in policing this issue, and it often sparks clashes. This activity was among the main triggers that led to the volatile events of last May, which is where we ended in that situation. So it's really something to hear that the Ministry of Internal Security took this into account, and I would love to hear more about what you think made that happen. And then tap on the question, like piggyback on that, the question about this government. How much is that related to the fact that you have an Arab party in the government coalition for the first time, the Islamic party? How much that influenced the visibility, the ability to have more sensitive implementation of such things on these issues?
So yes, first of all, the fact that there is an Arab party inside the coalition, and also that there is a few left center parties, other left center parties inside the government, did give some support, significant support to some of the processes that we've been promoting for several years now. I think many of you know that we are now at the end of a 5-year governmental plan to promote economic development in Arab society, 92, that we were very invested in promoting its implementation, but we also worked in the past 3 years very intensively on making sure and promoting the professional content of a follow-up plan for 92, ensuring that there will be continuance of this momentum of reducing the gaps between Arabs and Jews in Israel. And for many moments in those past 2 years with all the political instability in Israel, we weren't sure that there will be a follow-up plan. We were working on the professional content and developing it, but we weren't sure that there will be the political constellation that will enable it to actually be authorized. And certainly the new government made it possible. The fact that it's been put the way it put made it possible and made it much easier to pass this kind of decision, and also to make it much wider than 92 and include many other aspects that weren't included in 92, such as the field of healthcare, the field of welfare. 92 was much more focused on the very narrow economic perspective, and the new plan 550 widened the perspective to also social elements and also elements that relate even to the issues of identity in the education system that are very important for us. At the other hand, we see that the way this government is assembled doesn't allow any breakthrough in the issues of the relations between Israel and the Palestinian Authority. And so this issue of the more national issues remains still very volatile and very sensitive and very exposed to initiatives of the extreme right wing trying to actually bring down the government through its most sensitive parts, the issue in Jerusalem and the issue in the Negev. They identify this very sensitive issue and try to attack it. And so Amjad, I think.
Yes, I think that who tried to look to the government as one unit can see that this government has no common agenda, no common strategy. It's don't talk about justice for or equality for the Arab citizens, and not all of the ministers are committed to this goal. But despite of that, we see that in some of the ministries we have very important partners that we met them in the last years in the opposition, in the administrations, in the state and today they have very important positions as ministers, as deputy ministers, and directors of these ministries. We are talking about a very relevant ministries for the Arab society. For example, we talked about security, health, welfare, traffic ministries. And with this ministries, we can promote at least specific solutions for the Arab society. But the biggest challenge for us as organization with this government that it perhaps for the first time, at least in the last 3 or 4 decades from the 70s, that there are very big two Arab factions in the Knesset, the Joint List and the United List, the Islamic list, and one is in the opposition and the other is in the coalition, and there is a very I can say dirty conflict between them. And our mission is to maintain one distance from these two functions and to work with both of them to promote the common goals. It's not easy for us as an organization. We try all the time to keep also if we have correct criticism to express it by respectful and it's like in Arabic say to walk between the rain. As it's a very challenge for us.
It's in a sense, it's hard to overstate how dramatic it has been to have an Arab party for the first time be part of the governing coalition, and the fact that this has been able to push, as you say, socioeconomic agenda, but perhaps the compromises that Mr. Abbas, by pushing a pragmatic agenda, has said this is the goal, trying to get practical, tangible solutions. And I think right now that party is in the hot seat because the national issues are on the surface. National issues on Jerusalem over the Knesset break, suspended its participation and the joint list. I think that the tensions really came to the surface between the two different parties representing the Arab electorate. Rather than get into the politics, I want to ask you about this tension between the pragmatic and between the national concerns. Because how does that affect your fundamental goal of advancing a shared society? How do you balance being able to make certain advances on the very pragmatic, but perhaps having the national issue be so stuck? How does that affect what you think is possible to do to advance a shared society? And this is a surprise question.
5 years ago, anyone thought that the joint list is not was a staple. The joint list recommended for the president to give Gantz permission of coalition and yesterday, I don't know if you know, there was the Knesset to vote for the law that could to solve the government and dissolve. And the joint list voted against the dissolve of the government and Ram accept. They didn't participate in the so it's a very complicated. I think that the two of the factions have the same idea that we want to be effective, we want to be brand. The question is, what's the balance? Am I, as a politician or as a political party, can pay the price that the United Ram party pay, or that says that we don't care about the national issues. We trying to promote the single issues only, and I have to say to you that it's not that because they voted one and twice and 10 times for governmental laws and plans that strengthen the occupation. So this is I think that it's not true to say that the Ram don't care about the national issues. I think that this price is a very expensive price that the joint, and I am honest with you, I think that the joint is I support the choice of the joint, that this is a very expensive price that I cannot live with. I can't go to sleep. Let's put a key. with all of the decisions and the votes that the Islamic movement support.
This was always the question, right? If you break through and say an Arab party can be part of the coalition, what does it mean for an Arab party to take responsibility for the full actions of the government of Israel when it comes to all sorts of things that are controversial within Arab society? And this coalition, which spans Meretz all the way through Yamina, has been a challenge for all sides to keep that balance, to the point where it's attacked on a nearly daily basis, and has lost its authority over the break.
I think it's also very hard to draw a clear line between the civil issues and the national issues. And I think the right wing understands it very good. And I think it's not accidental that the extreme right wing in Israel, trying to ignite tensions and riots, specifically in those exact places where the line between the civil issues and the national issues are mostly blurred. For instance, in the Negev, the issue of recognition of unrecognized villages, which is in the agenda of the United States. It's clearly a national issue. And in the rights of the prayers in Amjad that you mentioned before, it's right on the line between the religious issues and the national issues. And I think it's not accidental. So those specific areas in which the lines are blurred in the midst of the public attention in Israel, because there are many forces that identify those areas as the weak areas of the government, and as the areas in which the agreement between Ram and Yamina and all of the parties are very, very fragile. So
these issues have always been hotspots, but they've been especially volatile since last May, when also triggers in Jerusalem led to widespread riots in big cities and clashes in Arab society. How did, even though there has not been renewed violence, many of those tensions are still unresolved. How did those events affect your work at Sikkuy Aufoq and really the work of shared society in Israel?
I think that to understand the effects of mine, we have to learn what happened and what a lot of activists compared these events to the events of October 2000. And I think that it was good to compare between them to understand what happened. And, especially that after the events of October 2000, there was our committee, that the official committee that
Research.
That research the reasons of these events, and talked about two pillars of the Israeli government. The first was the discrimination in the allocation of resources and budgets to the other citizens. And the second was the lack recognition of the Arab identity and culture and collective rights. And this committee recommended to the government to increase the recognition of the Arab citizens as collective, and to invest more for the Arab society. And if we 2 decades after that check what happened, we see that the government, especially in the last decade, invested unvested budgets for the Arab sector. And we know that these budgets were not because the government thought about history of justice. It thought about the Israeli interest of the economy. Senior experts and government officials concept that without the creation of the Arab city, the economy, the whole economy will collapse. And it's better that to see the Arab citizens as paying taxes than receiving refunds. And this in the field of recognition of Arab rights, it's enough to say to you that there was the national state plan, Nakbala, and Orwell, that the government promoted these years. So for us, it was clear that to deal with to address these events, we have to continue our work and our activity to promote more and more budgets for the towns, but it will never be enough without the recognition. And we have to talk about shared society. We are talking about shared society. We are talking that in the last decade, thanks to these plans, they became the Israeli society became more and more, if I can say that, the hospitals, the campuses, the high-tech, the employment zones became more and more shared between Arab and Jewish citizens. The Arab citizens today are not isolated in their towns, and they know about them only by newspapers. And the challenge is, how can we prepare these public spheres, these points that the Arab and Jewish meeting in them, to prepare them to be more inclusive, because without that, there will be points of friction, of fractions. And this is what we work in.
I will add 2 points to our insights from the event of last night that were truly shocking for all of us, I think. One is the neglection, I think, of both the government but also civil society organization of the field of mixed cities. Most of the efforts to reduce gaps between Arabs and Jews and to promote better future and shared society was in reinforcing and strengthening the Arab towns. But many important forces ignored the big cities, including us so far. And this is something that we are starting to consider how it will be best to invest our assets, knowledge, expertise, and also try to promote the gaps, the closing of the gaps and the addressing of the skill problem that exists in mixed cities in Israel, which are maybe the places in which Arabs and Jews interact on a most daily basis, and are the most those are the places in which maybe the potential, both the potential and the risk are bigger, the biggest of Arab-Jews relations. And the second thing is we saw around the events of May last year a very widespread public discourse around the frame coexistence, and we saw many people and organizations and institutions talking about coexistence. So banks and insurance companies putting like big street signs of protect. We have to protect the coexistence.
I mean, in response to May.
In response to the event, yeah.
making these
And other people were saying, oh, maybe the coexistence is dead. And we were actually amazed to see the grasp of the term coexistence, because we in Sikkuy Aufoq and other organizations in shared society, civil society in Israel, we don't believe in the term coexistence. We think that it's distorted terms that doesn't reflect how we want to see the relations between Arabs and Jews in Israel, because this frame doesn't relate to the power relations and to the discrimination that exists in reality, and try to normalize all of these things and start and imagine that we're starting the relationship between Arabs and Jews for a very equal point of beginning, and it's not the reality. In order to create better relations, we have to also acknowledge the deep segregation, discrimination, and forces that create the gaps between Arabs and Jews. And we believe in the term shared society as something that should be desired and pushed forward by organizations like us, but also government and finance sector and other forces. So this is also something that we're trying to challenge the public understanding of the term coexistence versus shared society.
I want to start opening it up to questions. So in the room, please just raise your hand. If you're on Zoom, there's a little, you can raise your hand or send Elisa a chat if you can't find that, and then we'll start having discussions.
Please put the microphone a little closer. We're just.
David.
I'm David Fishman, Gimbrich Family Foundation. This is our first opportunity face-to-face to be updated. Could you go back to the 550, the second 5-year plan? Give us the dates that we're talking, beginning and through when. What are the, we know some of the gains or improvements that 550 has done over its predecessor, basically, where they learned the gaps that were not covered. But you are in an excellent position to point out the areas that are still not covered in 550 that you would like to see. You just referred to the issue of linguistic or the terminological difference between coexistence, dukiyumiyut, and chevra mishutefet, a shared society. And I know that one of your predecessors is now working. Shuli Dichter is working in a new project called Nissan to come up with a new set of terms that can be brought into public use. But that's just one example of where things which you already alluded to. Can you speak to other currently recognized lacks in the 550 plan that you hope can be addressed either in the course of the plan or in the next one? But again, start with the dates. So the plan covers which 5-year period?
So first of all, the plan is for the years 2022 till 2026, 5-year plan. And regarding the aspects that are still missing in the plan, I will focus on specifically issues that related to recognition of identity, culture, etc. Because there are also other issues that are missing. But your question focused specifically on those kind of aspects, so I will try to focus on those. I think in the chapter that relates to education, there is beginning of there is a potential to cover the issue of education for culture and Arab identity inside the Arab education system. This is something that has been lacking for many years from the education system. Arab students doesn't learn about their history, their narrative, their heritage. They do learn about Jewish history, which is important in a shared society, but they don't learn about their own history, narrative, identity. And in order to create this equal and shared society, rather than two-kiyum or coexistence, both sides should come with strong understanding of their identity, culture, heritage, to create a shared basis. And this is something that has been lacking so far. The new plan does start to relate to it, but still something that important to understand about 550, that in some fields, 550 is a very right plan that has been thoroughly thought of and was a plan for several years, but in such as the field of housing and planning and other fields. But in some areas, it's a very premature plan that all of the details haven't been set yet. And for example, in this field of education, the plan actually said there will be a committee, and the committee will come up with conclusions, and we'll see what can be done. So this is actually an area in which still policy can be shaped in the right direction over the.
And what access does Sikkuy have for organizations that deal with shared society? Are you at the table to influence this kind of policy? Which tables are you at, and which tables would you like to be at?
Well, the majority of our involvement in this plan was about the issues that related to employment and economic development. But when we see that there is Ofer talked about education, there is another very important section about the culture, about the Arab culture, the invest in Arab historic sites in the Arab towns. And in these two fields, we were involved and worked with the Arab National Committee of the Mayors, the National Committee of the Arab Mayors, and we worked to promote these fields. But the problem is that, as Ofer said, that in this field, in this section, and in the other sections, the district said that there will be a small committee that will prepare a detailed plan. And here, our activity and our work is to ensure that there are Arab representatives of the Arab society in these committees. And this is not. We can't say that this is that we are satisfied about the situation, because we believe that without we and other organizations were around the table as the representatives of the Arab National Committee, but the real exam is to be part of the
the implementation teams.
I think this is what I was trying to get at with my question. Not so much are you there, but more take us under the hood of what it means to support effective policy making and implementation, so that these budgets, which are so big, this 550 is 32 billion shekel over 5 years. But from experience with 922, which had 15 billion shekel, in the end, with a year extension, what was it, 68% is
Around, yeah.
around is assumed to have actually gotten to where it's going. So you're on the you're there in a sense advocating for not just for that the budgets are created, but what does it look like? What are some of the steps to make sure that they do what they're supposed to do?
I will say that one big difference in comparison with 92 is that in the creation of 92, the civil society and Arab leadership was involved in very only the final stages of the policy making of 92. The government came up with a plan and presented it to the civil society and Arab leadership, and they
It was
made
based on a lot of Sikkuy work beforehand.
yeah, but they did adapted some of like major Sikkuy policy recommendation, like fixing the mechanism of allocation, etc. But the details inside the plan were made in the closed doors of the bureaucracy of the state, and then only presented to us and to other organizations and Arab leadership. In 550, the situation was much different because not only that the government was more open for a discussion, but actually we started working on the follow-up plan for 92 before the government started. We came up with our suggestions and our recommendation. There was a gradual development in civil society, both on the professional level, but also in the allocation of work, division of work between organizations. We had professional committees on housing and on transportation and on employment, and each of them came up with a professional recommendation. And on the other side, the government also, on those years of implementation of 92, learned how to work better with the civil society. And when they started to design this plan, they also invited representatives of civil society to the tables of how to make the plan, not only to react to the plan. It wasn't ideal. It still has a lot of learning curve to do, and it wasn't equal in all fields. It was felt that it was better and up and low, but the fact that civil society was around the table when the policy was formed, at least in some of the fields, that already gives us a better starting point for a 550 implementation. But as Amjad mentioned, the exam now is to see whether this approach will be continue in the implementation, because we know that there are implementation teams that not in all of them there is a representation of Arab society, leadership, civil society, and we work very hard to promote the situation that in all of them would be
If there's anybody online. So Donald, we're gonna, if you don't mind, we'll give the online a minute. Donald.
Okay, well, thank you, first of all, for this excellent presentation. I had a question about one point you made about the vocabulary people use, the idea that coexistence is the wrong word. And I guess the question I have, I often hear people in the shared society space talk about equality, but the concept of inclusion as opposed to equality is one I don't hear discussed as much. And to get to equality, I'm just wondering whether the idea of inclusion or the idea of trust is a vocabulary that needs to be used more often in the shared society space. I may be wrong, I may be missing it, but I hear equality a lot. I don't hear inclusion as much.
Let's take two more questions if you guys, so it's inclusion, Ayelet, and Nancy will come back. Okay. So Ayelet.
So yeah, hi, I'm Ayelet, and I'm here on behalf of the parents, I guess. I want to touch base on education and this is my focus. I have 3 kids that grew up here in Hashomer HaTzair, and every summer there would be a program that would arrive into camp through the other's eyes from Givat Chaviva. And it seemed to me that this is how it really opened the eyes of the Israelis or the Jewish kids to other cultural, inclusiveness. And because you talked about education, and of course the importance of the Arabs youth to learn their own history, but it seems to me that emphasis should be given a lot to open up youth from both sides to each other, and they'll grow up to be an inclusive adult. And I don't see that happening so much in Israel. I know that my daughter, she was in Israel for a whole year trying to get together youth from both sides, and she couldn't. And I'm wondering, what do you guys do about it? And if it's included in the big plans somewhere.
Can we collect one more? I'm keeping track of them. Okay.
My question is also about education, maybe a little bit of a different twist. And I was thinking, because I have 6 grandchildren in the States that go to Jewish day schools, and they don't get a lot of understanding of Arab culture, and even 2 of them are on a 3-week trip now, and I don't think they get that. But what I heard you saying earlier is that we want to have, or you want to have more opportunity for the kids in the Arab schools to learn about their own culture and identity. And how much is there a focus related to what Ayala was just saying, with the Jewish kids getting a history of the identity and culture of the Arab world and the Arab population, and vice versa, and it seems that if it's just like, gee, we want to help these Arab kids get more understanding of their own identity, but they still need to get understanding of Jewish history and identity, and the Jewish kids, and one's heard for years, and of all the negative kinds of things that go on and propagandistically in the schools, Arab versus Jewish, and that's really critical in my mind too.
So one question about the language of inclusion as well as equality and shared society. And then 2 questions related to education. And I think opportunities to learn about the other, whether it's formal or informal in the curriculum.
I will talk about education. Okay, about education, I have to say that Givat Habiba, Yad Biyad, and other organizations making a very, very important and brave activities and important meetings that can change the ideas and break the stereotypes about the other side. But I think that this mission has to be the mission of the state. The state, the education ministry has to help the teachers and give them the skills to address racism in the schools, in the classrooms, and to enable these like these meetings. And when Sikkuy is organization of policy changes, and this is our work. We don't organize meetings for pupils, but we working with the education ministry to promote like these meetings. And these meetings have not only to be in person. It's not only to give to travel in bus and to go to. It's very important, but also it can be by textbooks. In the elementary schools, we had research to look for stereotypes against the Arab society in this in the textbooks of the Jewish citizens, and we didn't find any stereotype because we didn't find any mention of Arab society in these textbooks.
So that touches on inclusion.
And I think that I can tell you that in the last year there's the government, the education ministry which is ministry that have a minister from the right wing. We see that there is, especially after the my events, awareness about the importance of education for church society, and the ministry established a forum of brainstorming about how to build church society, not only between Arab and Jewish citizens and all of its complications, but we as Sikkuy Aufoq with Jumaat Habiba, Yad Riyad, and other partners working to promote the education for church society in the schools. And about your question, I can say to you that one of the important recommendations that was adopted by the ministry, for example, that in the mixed cities, pupils, I think in
Eighth grade?
yes, have to learn Arabic, and Arab citizens, and I think that it's very important. You know, in the Jewish schools, there is something that they called roots project, that every pupil have to look for and research about the roots. It wasn't in the Arab schools. You know, I can explain about the first immigration for Jews to Israel, the second, third, about Echad Ha'am and Chernichovsky, and I didn't learn any word about Muhammad Darwish in the school. So to enable equal meeting between Arab and Jewish citizens, the Arab people have to build his identity, and I think that in 550, as Ofer said, we could see that for the first time, the official plan talks about these things. That if you talked about these issues in the last years, it was like to be extremist person.
I will address the question regarding inclusion and trust. I think I will address both of those words. Trust is certainly a very significant word in our lexicon, and something that we're working very hard to establish, because we think it's the key for many processes that happen not only between like people to people activities, but also like policy level processes. Trust is the key factor that one of the key factors that dictates whether a policy will go through and will be materialized or it will stay only on the shelf. And we work very hard to establish a trust relation between government officials and the Arab society, and I think those relations have two sides. The trust relations are fragile in both sides. I think both Arab leadership and officials in the Arab local authorities have low trust in the government, and the Arab public have low trust in the government, but also the other way around. Also, government officials many times have low trust in the capacities, in the willingness of Arab leadership and professionals to work with them, and this is something that we work very hard to change, and I think it is changing. During 92, it certainly has changed, and I think we saw the best example of the consequence of this change during the Corona crisis, where the government and the military has to work inside Arab towns to pull curfews and to make isolation and stuff like this, and it worked well. and they worked in cooperation with the Arab mayors, and they they succeeded in stopping the plague in Arab towns. And there's still a long road to go in this trust building process. I think the word inclusion is a very charged and complicated word in the relation between Arabs and Jews in Israel, because I think it can be used in different ways. I think we're certainly talking about an inclusive society in a way that it gives place to all cultures and all historical narratives, and inclusive in this way. But I think sometimes also the terms inclusion serves agendas that says, okay, the Arab citizens should be included in the Israeli society in a way that they will integrate in economy, but will put aside their identity, the collective identity, culture, and just integrate into the Israeli culture that been very Jewish dominated culture, and in this way, inclusion is a very complicated and charged term, I think.
Hachlala, is that what you're using? The word inclusion in Hebrew is hachlala, or?
Sometimes people use the word shiluv, or sometimes הכלה, להשתלב בחברה.
Okay.
כאילו.
That has different connotations.
Yeah,
It has different connotations.
Yes.
We can get back to that, but I want to ask Nancy.
Hi, Nancy Kaufman, New York Jewish Agenda. So if you didn't learn anything about Arab history and culture in your schools, I'm going to assume that in the Jewish schools, they certainly didn't learn anything about it. So that's just a comment. Question I have is to just go back to last May and sort of a retrospective till now, because a lot of this is, we're talking is very sort of bureaucratic, theoretical, hypothetical, hopeful about what's going to be with 550. But what's happening now, 1 year later, on the ground, and have things gotten worse or have they gotten better? And if so, why and how?
Can I piggyback Nancy's question?
I'll repeat the questions so that everyone else can hear.
So, because when you talked about a year since May, you talked about one of the differences being the police, the way that the police has chosen to handle it under Omer Bar-Lev and Tomer Lotan and all of our friends in that ministry. My question is about the role of the media in either escalating or de-escalating since last May. And in general, like the dynamics that you see inside of the Israeli media. I know that Sikkuy for many years worked on representation in the media together with Agenda and Anat and all of that, and had some major successes in terms of having more Palestinian voices in the Hebrew language Israeli media. But what do you see in terms of the choices the media is making about escalation or de-escalation? And what do you see as the dynamics for Palestinian speakers in the Israeli media and on these issues in general?
So I just want to repeat the questions because I don't think that online they can hear. Nancy commented that we're speaking a lot about budgets, which while they're so important, it's been such a key part of Sikkuy Aufoq's work in developing more equal policy. Until those make change, that's a long-term process. And asking, May happened last year. What's happening on the ground now? Give us some examples of what's happening on the ground now to create more societal resilience, shared society, address the tensions. And then Libby piggybacked on that, asking specifically about the media, the role of the media in escalating or de-escalating, and to share a little bit about Sikkuy Aufoq's work on in the media sphere in bringing more voices, more representative and more diverse voices to the public media space.
I can see that. One of the biggest differences between the events of May and this event, that biggest and the most dangerous inciter against the Arab society is not the Prime Minister. I think that
Is the,
Benjamin Netanyahu,
yes,
I think that he played a very dangerous role in the incitement against the Arab society. And we could see because of the political situation and the coalition that Benetton for 2 years ago was a very big inciter, and this event was very responsible and talked official language. And I think that this was a very affected all of the discourse in the Israeli society, including the media. I think that if you can check the differences between these two events, we all the time say that it's not incitement. It's not only the problem of the media. It's from the upper level of the political levels, and we say that in these events, the official politicians were very careful about their incitement. Statements, and the most dangerous is Benvir today, who's not a serious politician. He is very dangerous, but he's not the prime minister. He's a member from the opposition, and I think that in all of the last years, but especially in May, there were more Arab, not only as interviewers in the media, we could see Arab citizens, and I think that it makes a very big difference to see Amjad in 12 and Maswadi in Khan. I'm talking about Arab Palestinian journalists. In the Israeli media, I think that it made a balance that wasn't in the events of May. I believe that the media have and can play a better role, yes, but I think that it's very important also if we have criticism about this role, we have to see that I think in the right direction.
and so why don't you answer, like what is happening now? Is it better or worse? Or is there, what is actually happening on the ground in terms of?
If you can focus, what do you mean by on the ground? On
I mean,
no,
I'm thinking in terms of, the trickle down. Is anything changed in reality, in terms of leadership, in terms of, compensation, in terms of connection, in terms of shared society?
Yes,
how's it playing out?
When I talked about Netanyahu, I think that it changed the situation to the better direction. I think that we have we can see 550 and other governmental plans and projects promote us to a better situation. We especially after dangerous events like the last events, we can see that the infrastructure of shared society is very strong. I remember that after the events of October 2000, this organization was destroyed, and no one talked about church society and about this. And I think that it was a very good example for these infrastructures and to see that we can, we in the last years strengthen our abilities and our infrastructures.
If I could step out of my role for a second and say, I think it's a very hard question to answer about what's happening about shared society, because shared society is such a broad thing. And a few of the things that Ofer and Amjad mentioned, the fact that the Ministry of Internal Security might have some perception about working in a way that will not fan the flames is in a sense an achievement of a long-term process. I think one of the challenges, now I speak as a task force professional that's trying to bridge perceptions of American Jews on these issues and Israel, is that by speaking so much about shared society, sometimes there's a sense of there's so much going on, and there is so much going on. But the challenge of reaching all of Israeli society has to be so strategic for these. And I think that what Amjad and Ofer are talking about is trying to create strategies that touch on really influential points, make changes within the government, make changes among activists, what can an organization that is one of the strongest in Israel, but still it's part of a whole study, what are the strategies that can actually make change in the long term and short term? Do you want to add to that, Ofer?
Maybe I'll add that usually we are an organization that works on the long term.
Yes.
5 years ahead, 10 years ahead, but actually one thing that happened since May events, and Amjad touched on it earlier, is that the Ministry of Education understood that there should be some immediate change in the field of education for shared society, and they asked the forum of civil society organization, Sikkuy, Yad B'Yad, Givat Chaviva, Accord, and others, to come up with concrete recommendation for the next year that will start in a few months. What can be done in the immediate term, in the next year? And we came up with a very elaborated policy paper that was made out of the joint effort of all of the organization, and each one contributed its added value, and it's in a response the ministry said to us that they adapting many of our recommendations. They sent out a very detailed, still an internal paper that actually adapts many of our recommendations, included some of the ones Amjad mentioned before, this Root project, Arabic teaching in lower grades in mixed cities, and many others. And it's designed to be implemented in the next year. It's still not completely authorized. It needs to be authorized formally by the ministry, and we're hoping that it will be that way. But we're very optimistic that this is some kind of change that we will see on the immediate time frame.
I'm going to just throw this out there for a second. What the government right now is in the balance. What's at stake to these budgets, to these plans, if Israel goes into new elections? Do we not even want to think about it?
So specifically this plan that I now mentioned, we're actually working now to make sure that the Minister of Education don't buy into this plan, and to leave it to the bureaucrat staff, because if she will buy into this plan, and then the government will fall, another minister can withdraw it. But if it won't be related personally to this minister, another minister can adapt it and keep it going. So this is something that we're specifically working on there. In 550, I think the thing with 5-year plans is that they should be resilient to a change of government. Can be assured in 100%, but generally speaking, 5-year plans that was passed as a government decision is obligatory also to the next government.
Alan.
So interesting, just in terms of the education minister, something I've heard from your staff, we try to go in the door, and if we can't, we go in the window. So that's sort of finding the best way. So I want to go back to something you were talking about before about collective rights. And I'm just curious how that would work. What would that mean? Could you give an example? I think when you come at it from the US, where the only example we really have of this is relations with Native American nations, and that has not been too successful. So how could that work in Israel?
I think it's very complicated, and I think the complete solution for recognition of collective rights wouldn't be achieved just within the framework of Israel, but should be a part of the wider resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Because eventually, when we talk about collective rights, we talk also about national rights, and national rights relate also to the big question of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But I think also within this framework, very complicated framework where there is a state of Israel and there are occupied territories, and Israel is a Jewish state, and a Jewish democratic state, still there are recognition that can be made by the state in collective identity and cultural element of the Arab society that everyone will benefit from. For instance, if the Arab language will be visible in every public service that the government gives to all of the citizens. For instance, if Arab religious holidays, Muslim, Christian, Druze holidays will be celebrated and recognized in public arenas. If it will be a holiday like in labor places, if for instance Eid al-Fitr or Eid al-Adha will be a day off for every citizen in Israel, this will be a recognition of a collective identity that everybody will benefit from.
So it's not like creating an autonomy, like a political autonomy. It's necessarily, or at least these steps are creating, just recognizing culture in an official way.
I think that the Arab society took the decision. The Arab society in Israel, the Arab society said, and the Arab leadership, that we want to be an integral part of the society in Israel. We don't talk about internal enemy or something like that, but we in some of the questions like education for the Arab society, they are demanded, and I think that in the Ministry of Education there is a special unit for the Arab society, and in other questions. Our exam as Arab society not only to teach our pupils and our children what we want them to learn. I want also to affect about what your children learn in the Jewish school. I think that it's easier to talk about what I want to teach my pupils. And the question is, how can we be effective and influence the whole Israeli society? Because if we have the decision that we want to be, how they said, we are here and you are there, it will not solve the problems in the Israeli society.
We have about 10 minutes left. Oh, that's right. David, you had a question.
Thank you for broaching the topic of relations to the larger conflict and the international scene. 5 years ago, I would never have asked this question, but 5 years of 992 has been, and its successes and its development allows the question to be asked. are you in contact, more importantly, have outside groups such as the Palestinian Authority, the Kingdom of Jordan, perhaps some of the states around the Gulf states, have they been in contact with you to at least learn what you are doing and what is going on? This is not your concern, I understand. The concern is the Arab and Jewish relations within Israel. But just as you are informing American Jews today, are there other groups coming and trying to learn more from you on the other side?
I must say that currently there aren't those kind of interaction. I think it's also a feature of the field of civil society organization Israel, that most of the partners in philanthropy and comes still from the Jewish world. Yeah.
I wasn't talking about support, but rather curious learning from you.
Yeah, maybe I'll add something here from the strategic and the partnership perspective is in the long term, much the same way that I know that there's been meetings within the Irish is understanding how the people in Ireland solved the problem with the IRA and the Protestants and the Catholics and so on. Long-term meeting with people from their region for building partnerships. We'll put the support part aside, is going to be a necessity eventually on a long-term perspective.
We have now maybe 7 minutes left, and I sort of want to close on a bit more of an informal note. You are both directors of the Jewish Arab organization. You have Jewish and Arab professional staff with whom you have very close working relationship. You plan with, you process with all through these fluctuations. Can you talk to us about what that's like? What it's like to lead a shared organization? And take us a little bit inside. How are these conversations you have? How do you cope with the very difficult questions you deal with every day internally?
I can say that to lead a shared organization is for me it's a very big gift, because it's to give you the ability to work and to dive into words in my world as Arab Palestinian citizen, but also in the world of the and to learn in deep the perspective of the Jewish partner and partners in the stuff. So it's for me give me the ability to learn and to not only to learn in the theoretic yes, but in practice, how can we talk about this attack? How can we talk about this this plan? And it's a very I'm learning from this, and to be in go with a real partner like Ofer is not to be alone. It's to be that you have a partner that you can talk with them, like Co-Directors. One of the problems that they are alone. They don't have a partner to share with them. Only the partner in the life, husband or wife. But here we have in the professional. So I can say in one word, it's a very important gift.
I
I
would
think you owe him some love.
Yeah. No, it's actually something that gives a lot of strength because I think it's in every directive position that I believe many of you stand. Feeling of loneliness can be very strong, and when you have a strong partnership, and you have to work on a strong partnership, so it will be strong, especially in the Arab Jewish context. It gives a lot of strength. And it also gives you the ability to make better decisions. I think in all cases, when you make decisions alone, you have a very narrow perspective, especially when you direct in an Arab Jewish organization that focus on resolving gaps and tensions between two collective groups. Especially then, your perspective as Jew or as an Arab are limited. So having this, the ability to have shared perspective on every day-to-day decision, but especially decision that's related to the relation between Arab and Jews, is for me and for us, I think, is crucial.
So it sounds sort of easy.
No, I think all of what we said relate to the cases when the partnership works and when it's good, but it takes a lot of investment emotionally and intentionally, and to be very sensitive to each other in order to make it work.
And I assume the whole staff, right?
Of course.
Yes, it's not only between us. So when I'm talking in the media or in the interview or in conversation or in the staff meeting, I know that sometimes we don't, not little times, yes, we don't agree about everything, but we, our responsibility as directors of the organization is to put very high standards of respect and of that if I don't agree with Ofer, when I'm talking about sensitive issues, I say that I don't want to harm our partnership, not only as my partner Ofer, but all the stuff. It's you know, sometimes it's very complicated, and especially when there are hard events. But in these events, in the last events, we had 3 meetings for the staff in 1 month because we wanted to talk about this. In the last event, in the events of May, we talked less about the events, and some of the staff members thought that it was we didn't take in consideration their personal pain. And in these events, it wasn't easy, but we talked 3 times, 3 meetings, and we can see that it strengthened the stuff.
Beautiful. Just shows that it can be done in a higher.
So there's only one question that we didn't get to from online, which is the question of when will we have a complete and shared society? I think there's some urgency behind it. And I think that today we had an example of what it takes when. Thank you so much. This was a long meeting. Thank you for staying with us. Thank you everyone online. Thank you to, of course, Ofer, Amjad, and Marshall.
Thank you for your good work.
Thank you to everyone. You're welcome to, I don't know if you're running off.